Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This module, Women's Reservation Bill Major Provisions, is the third module of Unit 4th, that is Women and Reservation Contemporary Debate of the Women's Studies course. The objective of this module is to contextualize the introduction of the Women's Reservation Bill as well as discussing the major provisions of the bill. In this module, I begin by discussing the historical background of the question of women's reservation in representative institutions of India. I then discuss the specific data regarding the representation of women in the Indian Parliament and state assemblies. The data shows that the representation of women is abysmally low and something needs to be done about it, which sets the stage for the introduction of the Women's Reservation Bill. In the following section, I discuss the introduction of the Women's Reservation Bill in the form of 81st Amendment Bill 1996 and later 108th Amendment Bill 2008. I also discuss the major provisions set down in both the amendment bills. In the next section, I try to analyze the grounds on which the bill has been criticized and the alternatives suggested to the bill. In the concluding section, I tried to summarize. I shall begin with the historical background of the question of reservations for women in representative institutions in India, which has a long history of debate and discussion. It first surfaced in the 20th century with the attempts at creating a new political entity as the Indian nation, when it was realized and accepted that oppressed sections of the Indian people shall be provided a stake in their future. The removal of institutionalized inequalities became a political imperative, and it was realized that institutionalized countermeasures were required to undo the historical injustices. This imperative was acknowledged by the Constituent Assembly, and accordingly, the Constitution of India put forward the basic principle of equality of all citizens before the law, irrespective of caste, creed, or gender. Further, cognizant of the institutionalized inequalities existing in the Indian society, the Constitution provided a framework for positive discrimination, which became an instrument for affirmative action in the case of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. The question of reservations for women also came up before the Constituent Assembly. However, it was rejected by the leaders of women's movement themselves. The rejection was made on the plea that this kind of preferential treatment is to underestimate the strength of women to compete as equals and would imply an admission of inferiority. However, the confidence with which this rejection was made and the pleasure with which the provisions of gender equality in the Constitution were embraced could not survive for long. For this optimism belonged to the women from progressive middle classes, trained in higher education and having little experience of what life was really like outside their protected and privileged existence. A quarter of a century later, in 1974, the Committee on the Status of Women in India, CSWI, which was constituted in 1971, submitted its report towards equality. This report, which was considered to be a benchmark when it was first published, was an eye-opener. The authors of the report were shattered by their discoveries of the illusion of equality. The question of reservations for women surfaced again before this committee. Opposition came on similar counts as 25 years earlier from a section of women. However, the findings of the report revealed that while the participation of women as voters has been increasing, their representation as candidates was steadily decreasing. The report revealed that the condition of the lives of mass of Indian women had not changed in spite of progressive legal changes. Women continued to be underrepresented, and this inhibited their role in the decision-making processes. On the issue of rural women, the committee was unanimous in making the recommendation of establishment of statutory women's panchayats. The elected office bearers of these women's panchayats were then to fill the seats reserved for women by the Panchayat Acts in various states. The CSWI, however, rejected the reservation of seats for women in Parliament and state assemblies. This was not an easy decision. However, As the members could not reach consensus on this point, the decision was reached at by a majority vote, wherein it was decided to uphold the position taken by women leaders in the Constituent Assembly. Dissent was registered by none less than Veena Majumdar, Lotika Sarkar, and Neera Dogra, who pointed out that, quote, the committee had failed to address the problem of under-representation caused by institutionalized inequalities which 25 years of democracy had failed to dislodge, unquote. As Majumdar accepts, this stand marked an ideological and conceptual shift for herself and Sarkar, who as daughters of independence had rejected special representation or class representation regarding these as legacy of the colonial period, which institutionalized the backwardness of certain sections. The three activists also felt that greater heed should have been paid to the pleas of some social scientists that reservations for women was necessary for the health of Indian democracy. Iqbal Narayan, Upendra Bakshi, and V.M. Siriskar were prominent among these social scientists. Siriskar advocated reservations for women, hoping that this would bring qualitative change in the very character of Indian legislature and the process of representation. The debate within the committee on the issue of reservations for women in legislatures and parliament anticipated most of the arguments raised during debates on reservations for women today. Arguments made against reservations ranged from preserving male support in improving status of women to other theoretical issues. These included, first, it was thought that it would contradict the principle of equality enshrined in the Constitution of India. Second, there was reluctance to equate women with the socially backward and minority groups on grounds that women are not a community but a category and are not a socially homogeneous group. It was emphasized that women do not form a caste, do not occupy a region, rather they are across caste, class, region, etc. It was rather feared that even as a transitory measure, reservations for women would get translated into privilege for a few women from upper class and caste. Thirdly, it was asserted that women must come upon the strength of their abilities and not through special provisions. An acceptance of special provisions was believed to be rather retrogressive for women, and therefore an emphasis was made on competing with men as equals. Fourthly, a danger was sensed regarding ghettoizing of women's issues, projection of women as only women's leaders, and reinforcing. A danger was sensed regarding ghettoization of women's issues, projection of women as only women's leaders, and reinforcing the concept of separate identities, which could have threatened the integration of women in society. Fifthly, it was also emphasized that women are neither the only inhabitants of any constituency, nor do they represent any specific social group. Sex being the basis of selection of a candidate is therefore not logical. Next, it was also emphasized that although some of women's interests might be different from men's in some ways, women's interests cannot be completely seen in isolation from the social, political, and economic interests of the society at large. Lastly, it was feared that once granted, reservations would be difficult to withdraw and in the long term may promote a sort of vested interest in backwardness. Arguments were also made in favor of reservations, and these included, first, there was a concern regarding the number of women legislators which was abysmally low. 1952 onwards, the percentage of women among contestants remained virtually stagnant at 3.2%. The success ratio of women also declined steadily. Under such circumstances, women legislators remained a minority, confining the role played by them in the legislatures and the parliament. The inhibition regarding further continuation of this trend, adding to the limitations on role of women legislators, was cited as one of the arguments in favor of reservations for women. Secondly, it was argued that as a transition provision, reservations for women would break through the existing structures of inequality and would serve the long-term objectives of equality and democracy better than the present system. Thirdly, as a transition provision, reservation was advocated as an integral aspect of the necessity of broadening the political elite structure. It was believed that it would bring a qualitative change in the very character of Indian legislature and the process of representation. Fourthly, it was believed that it would help increase women's participation and motivate them to shoulder their political responsibilities. Fifth, it was believed that it would check the earlier tokenism and would help improve rural women's material, social, and political conditions. For over a decade, the committee's recommendations remained unheeded. It was only in the late 1980s that the debate was reopened with the recommendations of the core group appointed by the then Government of India to prepare the National Perspective Plan. The National Perspective Plan recommended 30% reservation of seats for women in panchayats and municipalities. The 73rd and 74th Constitution amendments provided for 30% reservation of seats for women in Panchayati Raj institutions nationwide. The enthusiasm that followed among women organizations culminated in the form of joint demand made by them to all the political parties before the general elections of 1996 for one-third reservation in the state assemblies and parliament. All the major parties accepted the demand and it appeared in their manifestos. As Menon points out, however, this was in spite that, quote, they themselves gave less than 15% of the total number of tickets to women, unquote. The common minimum program of the coalition government of the United Front included the Women's Reservation Bill and after assuming office, introduced the 81st Amendment Bill in 1996. This bill proposed reservation of 33% of the seats in the Lok Sabha as well as in the state assemblies. This implied that in those constituencies for which seats would be reserved, all contesting parties shall run only women candidates. In spite of the fact that every party had a section of people in the favor of the bill, it ran into an inconclusive debate. It was then referred to a joint select committee which had women MPs constituting one-third of its members. However, the bill was caught in the conflict emerging out of demands for special quotas for women of other backward classes and minorities. Even though the Joint Select Committee submitted its report in an year, it could not be proceeded for vote. The bill was again introduced by the BJP government as the 84th Amendment Bill in July 1998. However, it met strong opposition again and the discussion had to be stalled without the bill going to an initial vote. Particularly notable is that bill provoked a stormy session in the House featuring unprecedented scenes of snatching of papers from the Speaker and the Law Minister and the virtual coming to blows of members. Introduced a third time as the 85th Amendment Bill in December 2000, the bill met with a similar fate. Another time, the bill was introduced in May 2003. Again, noisy protests were staged and the parliamentary session had to be adjourned. While the bill suffered multiple derailments, the problem of under-representation of women in the parliament and state legislatures continues. The following section presents a picture of women's representation, thereby building up a case for as to why it is necessary to rethink on the issue of women's reservation, as well as analyze the causes for the derailment of the Women's Reservation Bill. Let us now look at some of the data available for women's representation in Parliament and state legislatures. First, let us look into what the figures say about representation of women in Lok Sabha. The first Lok Sabha of independent India had 22 women, which constituted less than 4.4% of the total number of representatives in the House. Table 1 shows that it increased marginally over the years till the 14th Lok Sabha, except in the 6th, where there were only 19 members in the House. In the 15th Lok Sabha, the number of women members was 58, constituting 11% of the total. The 16th Lok Sabha featured the highest number of women members, that is 62 women members, constituting 11% of the total. Even though touching the highest mark in the 16th Lok Sabha, which evoked optimism, the number is still abysmally low, reaching the 33% demanded in the Women's Reservation Bill based on the critical mass theory is still a far cry. Let us now look at what the figures say regarding representation of women in Rajya Sabha. In the Rajya Sabha, in 1952, the number of women members was merely 15, constituting 6.94% of the membership of the House. Over the years, the percentage of women has increased, and by 2008, the figure reached to 23 out of 242 members, constituting 9.5% of the House. Representation of women in state legislatures also has been abysmal. However, this is not specific to India alone and represents a picture which is true for most of the countries in the world. In spite of commitment by the international community to gender equality, gender gap in politics still exists. According to the United Nations Development Programme report in 2005, the international community reinforced the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Beijing Platform of Action, but only 12 countries had women who held 33% or more seats in their parliaments. Different countries have adopted preferential treatment, positive discrimination, quotas, etc. to reinforce their commitment to gender equality and ensure women's political participation. Let us now discuss the major provisions of the Women Reservation Bill. The bills for women's reservation were introduced in Parliament in 1996, 1998 and 1999 respectively, but could never be passed in the wake of strong opposition and intense controversy. Introduced the fourth time as the Constitution 81st Amendment Bill 1996 on 12th September 1996, it carried the following significant points. First, 1/3 of the total number of seats filled by direct elections in the House of the People and in legislative assemblies of the states shall be reserved for women. 2. 1/3 of the seats shall be reserved for women belonging to the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes from amongst the seats reserved for scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes under Clause 1 of Article 330 and Clause 1 of Article 332 of the Indian Constitution. Third, no reservation of seats in Lok Sabha for women from a state having less than 3 seats in the Lok Sabha. Fourth, if the number of seats reserved for scheduled castes or the scheduled tribes was less than 3 in any state, no reservation for women belonging to the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes was provided for in the state. Fifth, the seats were to be reserved for women by rotation in the manner laid down by law of parliament. Sixth, no time limit up to which reservation for women was to continue. Seventh, it did not provide for reservation of seats for women belonging to OBCs. Eighth, it did not provide reservation of seats for women in the Rajya Sabha and the legislative councils of the state. The bill was later referred to a joint committee of the parliament consisting of 31 members from both houses of the parliament after intense debate and heated dissent in the house that followed its introduction. The committee presented its report on 9 December 1996. The committee in its report inter alia recommended as under. The words "not less than 1/3" occurring in the bill should be replaced with "as nearly as may be 1/3." Second, the Legislative Assembly of the National Capital Territory of Delhi should also be brought under the purview of the bill. Third, the provision for reservation of seats for women should also be made in respect of nominations made under Articles 331 and 333 of the Indian Constitution. Fourth, the provision of reservation for women should cease to have effect on the expiry of a period of 15 years from the commencement of the Constitution 81st Amendment Act 1996. Fifth, the issue of extending the benefit of reservation to OBC may be considered by the government at the appropriate time. Sixth, the government should work out the modalities for providing reservations of seats for women in Rajya Sabha and in the legislative councils and bring out suitable legislation in this regard at the appropriate time. The Constitution 81st Amendment Bill 1996, as reported by the Joint Committee of the Parliament, lapsed with the dissolution of the 11th Lok Sabha. A similar bill, the Constitution 84th Amendment Bill 1998, was introduced on 14th December 1998. This bill also lapsed on the dissolution of the 12th Lok Sabha. Yet another attempt was made by introducing the Constitution 85th Amendment Bill 1999 in Lok Sabha on 23rd December 1999, but due to lack of consensus amongst the political parties, even this bill could not be carried further. The bill was introduced twice in the Parliament in 2003 but could not be passed. On May 6, 2008, the bill was again introduced as the 108th Constitution Amendment Bill. Highlights of the 108th Amendment Bill. The Constitution 108th Amendment Bill 2008 seeks to reserve 1/3 of all seats for women in the Lok Sabha and the state legislative assemblies. The allocation of reserved seats shall be determined by such authority as prescribed by Parliament. Second, 1/3 of the total number of seats reserved for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes shall be reserved for women of those groups in the Lok Sabha and the legislative assemblies. Third, reserved seats may be allotted by rotation to different constituencies in the state or union territory. 1/3 of the total number of constituencies to be reserved for women candidates shall be determined through a draw of lots. Lastly, reservation of seats for women shall cease to exist 15 years after the commencement of this Amendment Act. So there was an attempt to handle the issue of termination. There is a table that has been given here which compares the key recommendations of the Joint Committee on the 1996 bills and the provisions of the 2008 bill. While the 81st Amendment Bill says that reservation should be extended to Rajya Sabha and the legislative councils, the 2008 bill denies. The reservation should be extended in the first instance for 15 years, then reviewed to decide whether it should be continued. That is what is proposed by 81st Amendment Bill and accepted by the 2008 bill also. Thirdly, reservation should be provided for women from OBC after the Constitution extends reservations to OBCs is what was proposed by the 81st Amendment Bill, and it was rejected by the 2008 bill. Reservations to be extended to women of the Anglo-Indian community was something accepted by both the bills. Provision should be made to reserve seats in cases where a state has less than 3 seats in the Lok Sabha or less than 3 seats are reserved for SC/STs. This was accepted by the Joint Committee proposal as well as the 2008 bill. Legislative Assembly of Delhi should be included, accepted by 2008 bill. Substitute the words not less than 1/3 with as nearly as may be 1/3, accepted by the 2008 bill. The source of this table is report of the Joint Committee on the Constitution 81st Amendment Bill 1996, December 9, 1996, PRS. Amidst raging controversy and high drama, which resulted in suspension of 7 members who violently disrupted meetings, the bill was passed in the Rajya Sabha on March 9, 2010. Although this was considered as a historic moment in the protracted history of the bill, which met severe roadblocks, the bill remained pending in the 15th Lok Sabha and lapsed with its dissolution. I will now try to shed light on criticism of the bill and suggested alternatives. The failure of the bill to get passed in spite of concerted efforts from the women's movement and support for it from various political parties has been attributed to several conceptual flaws in it. Kishwar calls it a seriously flawed piece of legislation. The basic shortcoming is seen to be the reservation of seats through rotating lottery system, which according to Kishwar, quote, will automatically result in 2/3 of the incumbents being forcibly unseated in every general election, unquote, while doing no good to the women legislators as well, as they would get no time to nurse their constituencies on a long-term basis. Other grounds on which Kishwar criticizes what she calls the government's Women's Reservation Bill, GWRB, include putting an artificial freeze of 33% on women representation and ghettoization of women's politics. Further, she contends that leadership acquired in this manner would be construed as acquired in a manner which will still be seen as unnatural, artificial, and foisted on the electorate. Nani Vadekar also writes that rotation of reserved seats may reduce the incentive for an MP to work for his constituency, as he could be ineligible to seek re-election from that constituency. A study by Ministry of Panchayati Raj recommended that rotation of constituencies should be discontinued at the panchayat level because almost 85% women were first-timers and only 15% women could get re-elected because the seats that they were elected from were de-reserved. Accordingly, some alternatives have been suggested. However, the biggest showdowns on the bill have been staged on the issue of quotas within quota from the leaders of political parties like Sharad Yadav, Mulayam Singh Yadav and others. Alternatives to the bill. Two alternatives have been suggested to the Women's Reservation Bill. First, reservation for candidates within political parties, and second, dual member constituencies where some constituencies shall have two candidates, one being a woman. The most noticeable intervention has come from Madhu Kishwar, who proposed an alternative Women's Reservation Bill AWRB advocated by the Forum for Democratic Reforms. The other authors of the AWRB including Jai Prakash Narayan, Yogendra Yadav and Dhirubhai Sheth. Shetkari Sangathan leader Sharad Joshi is a staunch supporter of this proposal. The AWRB got the status of a private member's bill and subsequently got the support of the Chief Election Commissioner himself. The distinct features of this bill include: first, it recommended amendment to the Representation of People Act 1951, making it mandatory for every recognized political party to nominate women candidates for election in 1/3 of the constituencies instead of reserving constituencies exclusively for women as suggested in the Women's Reservation Bill. Second, for the shortfall of every single women candidate, two male candidates of the party shall lose party symbol and affiliation and all the recognition related advantages. According to Nani Vadekar, quote, the second point that provides for the penalty clause is the most problematic provision in the alternate bill, unquote. The other proposal is the suggestion of conversion of all constituencies into dual member constituencies by Rami Chabra. The proposal aimed at facilitating greater representation of women without disrupting the present balance among the different states by linking women's representation with the issue of delimitation of constituencies. A table has been presented which shows the pros and cons of reservations in political parties and dual member constituencies. While providing more democratic choices to voters has been considered as an advantage, the disadvantage is no guarantee that a significant number of women could get elected. The second advantage is it allows more flexibility to parties to choose candidates and constituencies depending on local political and social factors. Disadvantage is political parties may assign women candidates to constituencies where they are weak. Thirdly, the advantage of the political reservation in political parties is that they can nominate women from minority communities in areas where this will be an electoral advantage. The corresponding disadvantage seen is it might lead to resentment if a woman is accommodated to the disadvantage of a stronger male candidate. The other advantage seen regarding the reservation in political parties is it allows flexibility in the number of women in the parliament. Let us now see what are the advantages and disadvantages associated with the proposal of dual member constituencies. First, it does not decrease the democratic choice for voters. The disadvantages: sitting members may have to share their political base. Second advantage is does not discriminate against male candidates. The corresponding disadvantages: women may become secondary persons or add-ons. Third advantage might make it easier for members to nurture constituencies whose average size is about 2 million people. the corresponding disadvantages, to fulfill criteria of 33% women, half of the seats need to be dual constituencies. This would increase the total number of MPs by 50%, which could make deliberation in Parliament more difficult. The aforementioned table has been derived from PRS Legislative Brief, the Constitution 108th Amendment Bill 2008. Let us now try to summarize whatever we have discussed in this module. First of all, I have tried to discuss the historical background of how the question of women's reservation in representative institutions in India has been handled. The history tells us that for the first time the question surfaced in the 20th century before the Constituent Assembly, and then we see the women leaders themselves rejecting the proposal of reservations for women. After that, the question surfaces again at the time of the formation of the Committee on the Status of Women in India, that was in 1971, which submitted its report in 1974 towards equality, which was an eye-opener of sorts. The report actually shattered all notions of equality, gender equality in particular, and it actually signaled that something has to be done to increase the representation of women in political space to be able to ensure gender equality and justice in India. The committee recommended reservations for women in panchayats and municipalities. However, this committee also rejected reservations for women in legislative bodies. The arguments were actually modeled on the arguments given by women leaders of the Constituent Assembly. For around a decade, there was no heed given to the proposals made by the CSWI. However, the question resurfaced at the time of National Perspective Plan, and we see that was incorporated in the National Perspective Plan that 1/3 reservations for women should be made in municipalities and panchayats. Accordingly, the United Front Coalition government in 1996 proposed the Women's Reservation Bill for the first time as 81st Amendment Bill 1996. However, the bill got derailed, and after that the bill had been introduced in 1998, 1999 and subsequently in 2008 as 108th Amendment Bill 2008. But the bill has been facing multiple derailments. There have been several criticisms of the bill. One of these has been the demand for quota within quota. The others have been discussed in this chapter, that it is the issue of dual member, whether it can be resolved by having dual member constituencies. We have been given alternatives to the bill. The most significant alternative that is suggested is by Madhu Kishwar, who is given the alternative women's reservation bill. The other proposal is by Rami Chabra, where she says that all the constituencies should be converted into dual member constituencies. So the search for equality, the quest for equality for women continues and goes unabated. Thank you.